Welcome to the History Maps podcast. You are holding a piece of paper that dictates the exact movements of the enemy army.
Right.
And if you read it, you win the war. But the paper looks like absolute gibberish.
Yeah, completely unreadable.
Or you are a general and you are paralyzed by fear because your top detective is convinced you are outnumbered 3-1. But that army is basically made of phantoms.
Completely fabricated numbers.
Exactly. So today, the mission is to examine military intelligence during the American Civil War. We are doing a deep dive into how both the Union and the Confederacy gathered, protected, and analyzed information. And this covers the period between 1861 and 1865.
And we should note the sources for this deep dive include historical encyclopedias, National Park Service records, military intelligence analyses, and biographical accounts of specific operatives.
Right, because you are going to hear about a war that goes far beyond the standard timeline of battlefield maneuvers. I mean, this is an exploration of the invisible war of information.
This stuff happening completely behind the scenes.
Yes. We are going to look at how hot air balloons, mathematical ciphers, and enslaved people working in the shadows fundamentally shifted military strategies.
Well, to really wrap your head around the complexity of the intelligence landscape by the end of the war, you have to look at the baseline in 1861.
It was pretty much non-existent.
Completely non-existent. At the outbreak of hostilities, there was a profound lack of organization. I mean, neither the United States government nor the newly formed Confederacy possessed a centralized apparatus for understanding the enemy.
So there was literally no military intelligence branch at all.
None. Zero. This forced both sides into a corner where they had to, innovate through painful trial and error. And the Union, in particular, suffered from severe early failures due to this chaotic approach.
Right. And to see that chaos, we need to look closely at Major General George B. McClellan, specifically during the Peninsula and Maryland campaigns of 1862.
Yeah, McClellan's a perfect case study for this.
So he was the commander of the Army of the Potomac. And for his intelligence gathering, he relied heavily on Allan Pinkerton.
Right. And his detective agency.
Yes. Pinkerton was operating as an external contractor. He was a private detective, so he was highly accustomed to solving civilian crimes, tracking down counterfeiters or train robbers.
It was just a completely different skill set.
Exactly. He had absolutely no background in collating military data or estimating troop logistics or conducting large-scale strategic analysis.
And that lack of military background, well, it proved disastrous for the Union war effort. Pinkerton, who often operated under the alias Major E.J. Allen, utilized methodologies that were fundamentally flawed for a theater war.
Flawed how?
Yeah.
Like, what were his agents actually doing out there?
Well, he would send agents out into the Virginia countryside with very basic instructions. Just, count the enemy campfires, listen to local rumors, and interview whoever crossed their path.
Right.
Whether they were local farmers or deserters.
But, I mean, if you are Allan Pinkerton, you are looking at those campfires and doing simple multiplication.
Right, exactly.
You just assume one campfire equals 10 Confederate soldiers or whatever the ratio is, but you aren't verifying that assumption.
No, you're just writing the number down.
So if the Confederate Army intentionally lights 3 times as many fires as they actually need, Pinkerton's math immediately compounds a false narrative.
That is exactly the issue. The fatal flaw was that Pinkerton's agency provided raw, uncollated data.
Whoa.
They did not synthesize or verify the reports against other sources.
So it was just a pile of rumors.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
If a terrified local resident claimed there were 100,000 rebels over the next hill, Pinkerton often passed that number directly to McClellan.
Without even checking it.
Without cross-referencing it with cavalry reconnaissance at all. And furthermore, the Confederates utilized Quaker guns.
Which were just logs, right?
Yeah, logs painted black to look like artillery pieces from a distance. And Pinkerton's operatives, lacking any real military training, counted these logs as heavy artillery.
That is wild.
Because Pinkerton was highly prone to taking unverified visual reports at face value, he consistently delivered highly inflated estimates of Confederate troop strength to the Union High Command.
It is the mid-19th century equivalent of Googling a minor medical symptom.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Right. You have a headache, you consult a single unverified source online, and suddenly you are convinced you have a terminal illness. And that dictates a completely disproportionate response.
Yes, the panic sets in immediately.
So Pinkerton handed McClellan these massive numbers, and the result was overwhelming operational timidity. McClellan firmly believed he was vastly outnumbered by General Robert E. Lee.
And that belief caused him to hesitate, continually delay his marches, and refuse to engage even when he actually held the tactical advantage.
Which ultimately caused him to fail to seize Richmond in 1862.
Yeah, that operational timidity cost the Union dearly in both time and lives. It took the defeats at Fredericksburg in December 1862 and the subsequent Mud March in early 1863 to force a systemic change within the Union High Command.
Things had to get really bad before they fixed the system.
Exactly. Major General Joseph Hooker took command of the Army of the Potomac, and he recognized that relying on ad hoc civilian contractors was a recipe for continuous failure.
So he finally brings it in-house.
He does. He ordered his provost marshal, Marcena Patrick, to create a professional, formalized system for collecting and analyzing information. Consequently, on February 11, 1863, Colonel George H. Sharpe established the Bureau of Military Information, or the BMI.
And the creation of the BMI represents a massive paradigm shift in the history of American warfare.
Oh, fundamentally.
Because it was not just another detective agency contracted for a few months, it was the first professional, all-source military intelligence agency in United States history.
And it was a permanent staff section integrated directly into the commander's headquarters.
Right, they were not just gathering raw information anymore, they were actively processing it. To stick with that medical analogy, if Pinkerton was someone Googling symptoms and panicking, the BMI was a team of doctors running diagnostic tests.
Consulting specialists in different departments.
Exactly. Cross-referencing blood work with imaging and reviewing the entire patient history before making a final diagnosis.
Well, the internal structure of the BMI is what made it so effective. It relied heavily on distinct specialization. Colonel Sharpe understood that intelligence requires very different skill sets.
So how did they divide up the labor?
So Sharpe handled the overall leadership, the administrative liaison with field commanders, and the final strategic analysis. To assist him, he hired John C. Babcock.
Now, Babcock had actually worked for Pinkerton previously, right?
He had, yes. He was a civilian draftsperson, but he understood the flaws in Pinkerton's system firsthand. So Babcock served as the chief interrogator for the BMI. But more importantly, he compiled incredibly detailed order of battle charts.
What exactly does an order of battle chart entail in this era?
He kept track of every single Confederate regiment, brigade, and division. He noted their commanders and their historical fighting strength. It was a massive catalog. And then you had Captain John McEntee, who organized the scouting operations and established localized branch offices for the BMI directly adjacent to the combat zones.
This specialization allowed them to actually synthesize all these disparate streams of data.
Exactly.
They were taking in prisoner interrogations conducted by Babcock, reports from cavalry reconnaissance organized by McEntee, visual observations from the Signal Corps, and even gleaning logistical details from captured Southern newspapers.
It was a true all-source approach.
Yeah. Instead of handing the commanding general a pile of conflicting rumors, the BMI distilled all this information into daily, highly vetted written reports. They cross-referenced everything.
Right? If a captured Confederate infantryman told Babcock his unit was moving north, the BMI didn't just accept it. They checked to see if cavalry scouts or observers saw dust clouds moving in that specific direction.
The effectiveness of this becomes very clear when you look at their field operations, like the vignette of Sergeant Milton W. Kline.
Oh, that is a perfect example.
In the winter of 1863, Kline undertook an intensely dangerous mission to verify Confederate positions. He was disguised as a Confederate scout, wearing a gray uniform and carrying forged papers.
Which means if he's caught, he's executed as a spy.
Right, immediately. And he rode 250 miles deep behind enemy lines in freezing conditions. Over the course of 10 days, he systematically mapped over 125 rebel camps.
He noted the size of the camps, the insignia on the uniforms, and the condition of the horses.
And the granular data he brought back allowed the BMI to confirm the exact movements and locations of Lieutenant General James Longstreet's forces, because they could cross-reference Kline's map with Babcock's order of battle charts.
It was a fully functioning intelligence cycle.
But wait, if the Bureau of Military Information was this effective, providing such a verified strategic advantage to the Union, why was it completely dismantled immediately after the war ended in 1865? I mean, it seems like an institution you'd want to keep running permanently.
You would think so.
Nah.
But it came down to a lack of institutional permanence in the broader United States military structure at the time. The BMI was tied entirely to the specific needs of the Army of the Potomac during a specific national crisis.
So once the crisis was over, the funding dried up.
Exactly. Following the Confederate surrender at Appomattox, the military rapidly demobilized. They slashed budgets and reduced the standing army to a fraction of its wartime size. The prevailing attitude in Washington was that such a specialized intelligence apparatus was a wartime necessity, not a peacetime requirement.
Which is quite short-sighted.
Very. It would take decades, stretching well into the 20th century, for the United States military to reinstitutionalize the kind of all-source intelligence gathering that Colonel Sharpe pioneered.
But, while the BMI formalized and centralized the collection of data, a massive portion of their most valuable raw data actually originated from a source entirely outside of their direct military control.
Right, it came from a completely decentralized, informal network operating right in the heart of the South.
Yes, which brings us to what Union military men formerly called the Black Dispatches.
Right.
This term referred to the constant, vital stream of intelligence provided by African Americans. These were primarily enslaved people or those who had recently escaped their bondage and reached Union lines.
And their intelligence value was immeasurable.
Absolutely. They knew the local terrain intimately, they knew the back roads that did not appear on any surveyor's map, and they had access to areas and conversations that no white Union operative could ever hope to reach.
And the threat this demographic posed to the Confederacy was recognized by certain astute members of their own leadership. General Robert E. Lee and General Patrick Cleburne explicitly discussed the danger in their correspondence.
Cleburne actually wrote a memo about it, right?
He did. He went so far as to formally complain to the Confederate High Command, stating in a memo that the institution of slavery provided the enemy with an omnipresent spy system.
An omnipresent spy system. That is a very telling phrase.
It is. Cleburne recognized that the very people forced to build Confederate fortifications, dig trenches, and serve meals to Confederate officers were simultaneously cataloging resources, counting troop numbers, and listening to strategic plans.
Because there was this profound, systemic, cultural blind spot operating within the Confederacy.
Yes, inherently tied to the institution itself.
Because the entire societal structure of the South was built on the dehumanization inherent in slavery, white Confederate officials often behaved as if the black people serving them were completely invisible.
They treated them like pieces of furniture in the room.
Exactly. Confederate cabinet members and generals would openly discuss highly sensitive war-related logistics and battle plans over dinner or in their parlors, and they were completely ignoring the fact that the person pouring their wine or stoking the fire was listening to and remembering every single word spoken.
And this blind spot was systematically and ruthlessly exploited by pro-Union networks, most notably the Richmond Underground, directed by Elizabeth Van Lew.
She was a fascinating figure.
She was. Van Lew was a prominent, wealthy white resident of Richmond who held fierce pro-Union loyalties. She utilized her elevated social standing and, frankly, her eccentric behavior to deflect suspicion from Confederate authorities.
Right. She played the part of a harmless eccentric.
Exactly. All while coordinating a sophisticated network that relied heavily on the access and courage of African Americans. And the most consequential figure in this specific effort was Mary Bowser, who also operated under the name Mary Jane Richards.
Mary Bowser's story is the ultimate example of exploiting that cultural blind spot because she had actually been educated in the North, largely funded by the Van Lew family.
She even spent time in Liberia as a missionary in 1855 before returning to Richmond.
Right. So when the war broke out, Van Lew managed to get Bowser placed as a regular servant right inside the Confederate White House.
The official residence of Confederate President Jefferson Davis.
Yes. And Bowser intentionally adopted a persona. She pretended to be entirely uneducated, illiterate, and slow-witted.
By playing directly into the deep-seated racial prejudices of the Confederate leadership, she rendered herself completely invisible to them. They did not monitor her presence in the room at all.
But Bowser possessed an eidetic or photographic memory.
Which is just a massive advantage in espionage.
Right. So while she was cleaning Jefferson Davis's private office, dusting his desk, or serving meals to the Confederate cabinet, she just read the military dispatches left out in the open. She memorized troop deployments, supply shortages, and the strategic debates occurring between Davis and his generals.
But how did she physically get that information out of the Confederate White House? I mean, she couldn't just walk out with a notebook full of stolen documents.
No, absolutely not. She relied entirely on her memory and the informal network Van Lew established. Bowser would commit the documents to memory verbatim. Then, during her errands or on her sanctioned time off, she would secretly meet with Van Loo or other couriers on the outskirts of Richmond, or even at the local market.
And she would just recite the information perfectly.
Exactly. Sometimes she would encode the information in seemingly innocuous letters, or the network would hide written transcriptions in the false bottoms of market baskets or woven into the laundry. And that information was subsequently smuggled across the lines to Union generals.
It is an incredibly sophisticated operation. And after the war, she actually gave public lectures in the North, speaking in cities like New York under pseudonyms like Richmonia Richards.
Oh, she kept using aliases.
Yes. She would strategically alter details of her biography depending on the audience she was speaking to, which demonstrates a continuous, highly strategic management of her own identity to protect herself and her network even after the conflict ended.
She eventually went on to work as a teacher for the Freedmen's Bureau, right?
She did. But Bowser was not the only African-American woman using her intellect to dismantle the Confederacy. You have to look at Harriet Tubman.
Right. The historical memory mostly associates her with the Underground Railroad, but her tactical military intelligence work for the Union Army is extensive.
Very extensive. Tubman operated primarily in the coastal regions of South Carolina. She was working directly with Colonel James Montgomery and the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers.
Which was a Union regiment composed entirely of black soldiers.
Exactly. Now, the Union forces desperately needed intelligence on Confederate fortifications, troop strength, and supply lines along the complex, winding waterways of the Lowcountry. So Tubman, utilizing military funds, organized and led a formal espionage ring.
She recruited scouts, correct?
Yes. She recruited 9 former slaves to act as scouts and agents. And several of these men were highly skilled riverboat pilots who had spent their entire lives navigating those specific waters.
So they possessed intimate, localized knowledge of the riverbeds, the tides, and the currents.
Which was critical because the Confederates had placed remotely detonated torpedoes throughout the waterways to destroy Union patrol boats.
What we would now call underwater mines.
Yes, exactly.
But how did Tubman's operatives locate those underwater mines without sonar or modern equipment? Did they just guess where they were?
No, they located them through a combination of environmental observation and human intelligence. The riverboat pilots knew how the water was supposed to flow, so they could spot unnatural ripples or disturbances that indicated a submerged object or the wires running to the shore.
Oh, they could read the water itself.
Exactly. Furthermore, they utilized the Black Dispatches network on a micro level. They covertly interrogated enslaved fishermen and plantation workers along the riverbanks.
Ah, the very people who had been forced by the Confederates to plant those mines in the first place.
Precisely. They extracted the exact locations of the minefields and the shore batteries from them.
So Tubman and her network mapped the exact locations of those mines. And this tactical intelligence culminated in the Combahee River Raid in June 1863. Tubman actually guided 300 black Union troops up the river at night.
And because of the intelligence her scouts provided, the Union gunboats navigated safely past every single minefield.
The raid was a massive tactical success. They landed troops, destroyed Confederate supply depots, burned warehouses full of cotton, and freed more than 750 enslaved people in a single night.
And brought them safely back to Union lines.
Yes. The impact of the Black Dispatches on the outcome of the war is substantial.
It is. You pointed out earlier the immense personal risk involved in espionage. If a white Union spy, like a member of the BMI, was caught behind enemy lines out of uniform, they faced military prison or execution. But if an enslaved person or a free black operative like Bowser or Tubman was caught passing information, they lacked any protection under the laws of war. The retaliation from Confederate authorities or local militias was often immediate, extralegal, and brutal.
It highlights a deep irony in the conflict, really. The institution of slavery, which the Confederacy was fighting a war to preserve, provided the Union with its most effective, omnipresent weapon against them.
A weapon they completely failed to see until it was too late.
But it brings up a logistical hurdle. If someone in Richmond overhears a conversation or a scout maps a camp, how did that physical information travel from deep within Confederate territory across heavily guarded battle lines to the Union Army without being intercepted by pickets?
Well, moving the physical information was heavily dependent on informal civilian networks. Information was often passed verbally from farm to farm through what was colloquially known as the grapevine telegraph.
Just word of mouth through trusted sources.
Exactly. In more organized espionage rings like Elizabeth Van Loo's in Richmond, they used dedicated physical couriers. These couriers utilized hidden compartments built into farm wagons or hollowed out everyday objects like books or shoe heels.
Because the physical movement of human spies and couriers was a constant necessity early in the war. Electronic communication was not always available in the field.
Right, and this reliance on human couriers bridges us to another aspect of the intelligence war, one where the Confederacy utilized physical movement, civilian networks, and high society access to gather their own intelligence against the Union.
Because while the Union was building the highly centralized Bureau of Military Information, the Confederacy relied much more heavily on decentralized field reconnaissance and independent espionage rings.
And this is where civilian Confederate spies come into the picture. Many of these operatives were local residents who used their home ground advantage.
They knew the back roads, the local topography, the hiding spots, and the sympathetic households far better than the invading Union forces ever could.
And the gender dynamics of the era played a massive role in Confederate espionage. Operatives like Rose O'Neal Greenhow in Washington and Belle Boyd in Virginia weaponized the societal expectations of the mid-19th century.
Right, because Victorian society dictated that women were inherently delicate, apolitical, and completely harmless.
They were viewed as simply incapable of understanding the complexities of military strategy. So these women actively used that stereotype as a cloak of invisibility.
They would just socialize with enemy officers, using charm, hospitality, and flirtation to loosen tongues and extract highly sensitive military intelligence.
They operated safe in the assumption that a 19th century military officer would never suspect a socially prominent woman of conducting espionage.
Belle Boyd is a prime example of this methodology in action. She operated primarily in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, and her entry into the war was not through a formal recruitment process. It was intensely personal.
Yeah, her origin story is quite dramatic.
In July 1861, in her hometown of Martinsburg, a group of Union soldiers forced their way into her family's house to raise the Union flag over their roof. And during the confrontation, 17-year-old Boyd pulled a Derringer pistol from her dress and shot Private Frederick Martin. She mortally wounded him right on her own property.
And she claimed self-defense against a hostile invader.
Which, remarkably, the local Union commander, General Robert Patterson, investigated and essentially let her off with a mere reprimand.
He even posted sentries outside her house to protect her from further harassment.
That specific incident underscores how reluctant 19th century military men were to apply the harsh realities of martial law to young, white women of social standing.
Escaping punishment for killing a soldier emboldened Boyd significantly. She immediately began gathering intelligence from the Union forces occupying Martinsburg. She was intentionally seeking out the company of Northern officers, inviting them to dinner, and writing down whatever strategic details they let slip.
Her early methods were decidedly amateur, though. She wrote notes, which she romantically called lettres de cachet, and smuggled them to Confederate camps by hiding them in the soles of her shoes, sewing them into her corsets, or even baking them into loaves of bread.
Very improvised methods.
But if we think about modern cybersecurity, Boyd's methods were pure social engineering. She didn't hack a secure network. She used charm, social norms, and the assumption of trust to completely bypass security protocols.
The Union officers simply handed over the proverbial passwords because she asked nicely at a parlor gathering.
Right, and her social engineering yielded significant tactical results on the battlefield, like in May 1862.
Right, the Front Royal incident.
Union General James Shields had requisitioned her uncle's hotel in Front Royal, Virginia, to serve as his headquarters, and Boyd eavesdropped on Shields' private staff conferences by laying on the floor and listening through a knothole in the floorboards.
The room directly above the parlor.
Exactly. She overheard Shields give specific, detailed orders about marching his forces to attack Confederate General Stonewall Jackson's flank. Boyd translated the orders into a basic cipher, got on her horse, and rode 15 miles through the night, crossing Union picket lines to warn Confederate Colonel Turner Ashby of the impending movement.
And because of her warning, Shields marched his army out, but Jackson's forces were not where the Union expected them to be. A few weeks later, on May 23, 1862, the battle at Front Royal broke out.
Union forces were actively trying to evacuate the town and burn their supplies before the advancing Confederates could capture them. And Boyd literally ran out of town, dodging Union bullets across the skirmish line, waving her white bonnet to catch the attention of the approaching Confederate forces.
She delivered a breathless message directly to Stonewall Jackson's aide, Lieutenant Henry Kidd Douglas. She told him the Yankee force holding the town was very small, consisting of only one Maryland infantry regiment and a few cavalry companies. She urged them to charge immediately before the Union could burn the armory.
And Jackson took her advice. He attacked quickly and won a resounding victory, capturing the town, the desperately needed supplies, and 700 Union prisoners.
But her luck didn't last forever. Boyd was arrested multiple times for her actions over the course of the war. She was even held in the old Capitol Prison in Washington, D.C., under harsh conditions.
So, considering she was caught repeatedly, caught with cipher texts on her person, and openly admitted to espionage, why was she continually released, banished to the South, or exchanged instead of facing a military firing squad?
Again, the prevailing social codes regarding gender protected her from the ultimate penalty. Union authorities, particularly figures like Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, found her incredibly frustrating and dangerous. But executing a prominent young female civilian would have been a catastrophic public relations disaster for the Lincoln administration.
It would have violated the era's strict codes of chivalry.
Yes, and outraged the Northern public, and potentially galvanized international sympathy for the Confederacy. The Union High Command preferred to hold her in prison, exchange her for Union officers, or eventually deport her.
It is a fascinating dynamic. However, while human couriers like Belle Boyd were effective locally, the scale of the Civil War was expanding rapidly. Coordinating massive armies across hundreds of miles required a speed of communication that a horse and rider simply could not match.
Both sides had to rely heavily on technology, specifically the electric telegraph.
The telegraph revolutionized military communication, compressing days of travel into minutes. But it introduced a massive vulnerability.
Wiretapping.
Exactly. Tapping a telegraph wire was a relatively simple mechanical process. If you sent a message over the wire in plain text, an enemy cavalry unit could just climb a pole in the woods, clip a portable telegraph key onto the wire, and read your entire operational plan as it was transmitted.
This absolute necessity for secure communication pushed both armies deep into the realm of cryptographic warfare.
And they took very different approaches. The Union and the Confederacy adopted completely different mathematical philosophies for their cryptography.
They did. The Union utilized a root cipher, which is a word-based transposition protocol.
While the Confederacy utilized the Vigenère cipher, which is a letter-based polyalphabetic substitution system.
And the underlying mechanics of each cipher dictated their successes and their catastrophic failures during the war.
So let's break down exactly how they worked. Think of the Union root cipher like a complex word search puzzle where the words are already filled in, but you have to know the exact path your pencil needs to take to read the sentence.
Right. The cipher clerk took an entire meaningful message and wrote it out in a grid.
Then they jumbled the order of the words based on specific prearranged route paths. You might read up column 1, down column 4, across route 2, and so on. And to make it harder, they added null words.
Which were just random, meaningless words.
Right, words like horse, river, or Jupiter scattered throughout the grid to confuse anyone trying to reconstruct the path.
Because it transmitted whole, real words, it proved incredibly resilient to the high rate of transcription errors common in Morse code. If a telegraph operator missed a dot or dash in a word, the receiving clerk could usually still deduce the word from context.
And the historical record shows that the Union root cipher was highly effective for field operations. The Confederacy intercepted thousands of encrypted Union messages over the course of 4 years, but Confederate cryptanalysts never successfully cracked a single rote cipher text during the entire war.
Which is an impressive track record. The Confederate Vigenère cipher, however, was a completely different story. Historically, the Vigenère system was considered mathematically unbreakable for nearly 300 years.
Right.
It uses a 26 by 26 grid of the alphabet, known as a Vigenère square. It shifts the letters of the plaintext message based on a specific repeating keyword.
Right, so instead of a simple Caesar cipher where you just swap A for B every time, the substitution changes depending on the corresponding letter of the keyword.
Exactly. And to encode a message quickly in the field, Confederate signal officers often used a physical device called a Barker cylinder.
What did that look like?
It was a wooden cylinder wrapped with a printed Vigenère table, featuring a sliding brass pointer on a bar.
So the source provides a specific example of the math here. Let's walk through it.
Sure.
If your keyword is complete victory and you want to encrypt the word Lee, you align the first letter of the message, L, with the first letter of the keyword C on the grid. That intersection gives you the ciphertext letter N.
Right. And then the next letter of the message, E, aligns with the second letter of the keyword O. That gives you S.
And the second E in Lee aligns with the third letter of the keyword M to give Q. So the plain word Lee becomes the ciphertext NSQ.
Mathematically, on paper, it is a very strong cipher for the mid-19th century. But cryptography is only as strong as its operational security. And the Confederacy committed a fatal flaw.
Extreme key staticity.
Yes. For a polyalphabetic cipher to remain secure against analysis, you must change the keywords frequently and randomly. The Confederacy, however, relied almost exclusively on just 3 keywords for field operations for the entire duration of the war.
3 keywords for 4 years of war.
Yes. Those phrases were Manchester Bluff, complete victory, and come retribution.
They also possessed a 4th phrase, where liberty dwells, there is our country, but that was utilized almost exclusively for transatlantic diplomacy with envoys in France.
Exactly.
Wait, hold on. They had a mathematically robust cipher system, and they basically used password 123 for 4 years. Think about how you secure your home network today. You change the password if you think it is compromised.
You would hope so.
Why wouldn't someone in the Confederate command instantly realize how reckless it is to use Manchester Bluff for years on end? Why didn't the signal officers just distribute new keywords every week?
It was an insurmountable logistical nightmare given the state of the Confederate infrastructure. To change the keyword securely, you cannot transmit the new word over the telegraph.
Oh, because anyone listening would have the new key.
Precisely. You have to physically deliver the new written keyword to every single telegraph operator and general in the field. And the Confederate armies were spread across vast distances, from Virginia to Texas, often disconnected by Union naval blockades or disrupted supply lines.
So if a courier carrying the new keyword was captured by Union cavalry, the entire system was compromised immediately.
Yes. Furthermore, if a courier was simply delayed by weather, one army would begin transmitting using the new key while the receiving army was still operating on the old one.
Rendering the strategic messages completely unreadable to their own generals.
Right. Faced with these challenges, Confederate command prioritized ease of use over security. They kept the keys static so everyone always knew how to communicate.
And the Union completely exploited that laziness. Because the keywords were static, Union cryptanalysts could apply frequency analysis. Specifically, they used a technique similar to the Kossiski examination.
Once they intercepted enough messages, they could look for repeater chunks of ciphertext, like that NSQ sequence we mentioned.
By counting the number of letters between those repeating sequences, they could mathematically factor out the length of the keyword. Once they knew the keyword was 15 letters long, like complete victory, cracking the code was just a matter of time.
And we see this perfectly illustrated in the fall of 1864. On September 30th, Jefferson Davis sent a highly sensitive dispatch to General E. Kirby Smith. He was ordering him to move his forces across the Mississippi River.
Davis encrypted that critical strategic message using the keyword complete victory.
However, Union cipherers stationed in New Orleans had captured earlier Confederate key documents after the fall of Vicksburg the previous year.
So by applying frequency analysis based on those captured documents and understanding the static nature of the Confederate system, they cracked Davis's message by October 17th.
They intercepted and decoded the strategic orders of the Confederate president in just over 2 weeks.
And sometimes the Union didn't even have to do the complex math. Operational security was occasionally non-existent on the ground.
Oh, the Shiloh incident.
Yes. After the Battle of Shiloh, a Confederate telegraph operator who actually held Union sympathies simply walked over and handed a complete written cipher key to the Union Army.
Just handed it over.
The Union command then authorized the publication of the entire key in a New York newspaper, exposing the Confederate cryptographic system to the entire world.
But the telegraph, whether it was perfectly encrypted or completely compromised, had a fundamental physical limitation. It required miles of copper wire.
Right. And on a fast-moving, chaotic battlefield, Stringing telegraph wire across miles of contested, wooded, artillery-pounded terrain was often impossible,
Armies needed a way to communicate tactically across the actual field of battle, coordinating artillery and infantry movements without relying on physical infrastructure.
which led to the widespread adoption of aerial telegraphy, specifically the visual communication method known as the wigwag system.
And the quest for the high ground.
Wigwag was invented in the 1850s by a U.S. Army surgeon named Major Albert J. Meyer. He developed the system, and his primary assistant during the testing phase was a young lieutenant named Edward Porter Alexander.
But when the war broke out, Alexander resigned his U.S. commission and joined the Confederacy.
That defection created a highly unique situation in military history. Alexander went on to organize and train the Confederate Signal Service. This meant that from the very beginning of the conflict, both the Union and the Confederate armies were utilizing the exact same tactical signaling system.
They were using the exact same manual written by Meyer.
So let's break down how wigwag actually works. It operates essentially as visual binary code. A signalman stood in a highly visible position, a hilltop, a wooden observation tower, or a church steeple, and they held a single flag on a long pole.
During the day, it was usually a white flag with a red square in the center to provide contrast against the sky or the trees. At night, they swapped the flag for a turpentine-fueled torch.
The flagman held the flag vertically. Waving it down to the left represented a 1. Waving it down to the right represented a 2.
By combining those ones and twos, they could spell out any letter or predetermined phrase. For example, the letter A was signaled by waving left, then right. So 1, 2.
While it is a rudimentary system, it is remarkably similar in concept to modern digital transmission. It is like an early analog version of optical fiber data transmission. You are using visual pulses to send binary data across a distance.
And the tactical advantages were clear. It was highly portable. A signalman just needed his flags, a torch, and a code book.
It could be used silently at night across miles of terrain, and it was entirely immune to enemy cavalry units cutting telegraph wires.
But the limitations were equally stark and often fatal. It required absolute, uninterrupted line of sight. If there was heavy fog in the valley, thick smoke from artillery fire rolling across the battlefield, or dense foliage blocking the view, the entire system failed.
More perilously, to achieve that line of sight, the signalmen had to stand out in the open on elevated positions, silhouetted against the sky. This made them prime, highly visible targets for enemy sharpshooters.
Finding that high ground was essential for wigwag to function. But the Union Army decided to take the concept of the high ground to an unprecedented level to avoid the terrain limitations entirely.
They took to the sky. The American Civil War saw the world's first large-scale deployment of aerial platforms for military reconnaissance with the creation of the Union Army Balloon Corps.
This endeavor was spearheaded by Thaddeus S.C. Lowe, a prominent civilian aeronaut and inventor.
On June 11, 1861, Lowe wanted to prove the military value of balloons to a highly skeptical War Department. He ascended 500 feet over the National Mall in Washington, D.C. in his gas balloon, the Enterprise.
Lowe took a telegraph key up in the wicker basket with him, connected by a wire running down the tether rope to the ground below. From 500 feet up, he sent a telegraph message directly to President Lincoln in the White House.
He stated that his vantage point commanded an area nearly 50 miles in diameter. Lincoln, who was always interested in new technologies, was convinced of the strategic value immediately.
He established the Balloon Corps as a civilian organization operating under the topographical engineers, and authorized Lowe to build a fleet of specially designed military-grade balloons.
The logistics behind this operation were incredibly sophisticated for the 1860s. You couldn't exactly pipe municipal coal gas out to a battlefield in rural Virginia to inflate these massive envelopes.
No, so Lowe designed mobile gas generators. He built sturdy, horse-drawn wagons outfitted with heavy, copper-lined wooden tanks.
And the crew mixed iron filings with sulfuric acid right there on the battlefield.
Yes. The chemical reaction generated intense heat and pure hydrogen gas, which was then cooled, purified, and pumped directly into the balloons. It was a highly complex and highly flammable industrial process occurring under the threat of artillery fire.
And Lowe's innovation didn't stop on land. In late 1861, he acquired a coal barge called the George Washington Parke Custis. He had the superstructure cleared off, creating a flat, open deck.
They used this modified barge as a riverborne launching pad for the balloons along the Potomac and James Rivers. It allowed the Union to tow the fully inflated balloons up and down the waterways with a steam tug, conducting continuous, shifting aerial surveillance of Confederate fortifications.
Historically speaking, the Custis functioned as the world's first aircraft carrier,
It really did.
and the tactical advantage provided by this aerial perspective was profound. During the Battle of Fair Oaks during the Peninsula Campaign, the ground was heavily wooded and swampy. Union generals on the ground couldn't see the Confederate troops maneuvering through the dense trees just a few hundred yards away.
But Lowe was up in his balloon, tethered high above the battlefield, looking down over the canopy. He used the telegraph wire to transmit real-time reports of Confederate troop movements, detailing their hidden flanking maneuvers.
General McClellan used that real-time intelligence to deploy artillery and infantry reinforcements exactly where they were needed, successfully countering the Confederate attack.
The Confederates certainly recognized the threat these balloons posed. The psychological impact of knowing the enemy was watching their every move was significant.
The Confederates had to spend valuable time and resources blacking out their campfires at night and building elaborate dummy fortifications to deceive the observers in the sky.
The Confederacy even attempted to launch their own balloons to counter the Union advantage. They lacked the industrial resources and the chemical generators of the North, so they built the famous silk dress balloon.
They stitched together multicolored strips of dress silk and inflated it with municipal gas in Richmond.
However, that balloon, tethered to a tugboat, was captured by Union forces in July 1862, effectively ending the Southern aeronautic experiments.
Wait, if Lowe's balloons were providing real-time overhead intelligence that literally stopped flanking maneuvers and saved Union forces, why was the Balloon Corps disbanded by August 1863, long before the war was even close to being won?
It was entirely a victim of military bureaucracy, clashing egos, and internal politics. Following leadership changes in the Army of the Potomac, Captain Cyrus Comstock was assigned to oversee the operations of the Balloon Corps.
And he didn't like Lowe's.
Comstock was an engineer who fundamentally did not value the aeronauts' contributions. He viewed them as an expensive civilian novelty. He slashed their operational funding, drastically reduced Lowe's pay, and restricted their access to the front lines.
Plus, Lowe faced continuous accusations of financial mismanagement regarding the expensive chemical equipment.
Exactly. Frustrated by the lack of institutional support, the constant bureaucratic infighting, and the disrespect from the military brass, Lowe resigned his position in May 1863.
And without his specific technical expertise and driving vision, the Corps quickly fell apart and was officially disbanded by August. The military bureaucracy simply lacked the institutional vision to see aviation's permanent long-term value at that time.
Which brings us to a complex realization about the entirety of this conflict.
Right. When you look back at the massive scope of military intelligence during the Civil War, you are witnessing the messy, chaotic birth of modern operational methods.
You see the implementation of real-time aerial reconnaissance, the structured interception and mathematical decryption of signal traffic, and the creation of professional, all-source intelligence bureaus synthesizing data for field commanders.
Yet, despite all this technological innovation, the mobile hydrogen generators, the Visionaire squares, the binary wigwag codes, the most accurate and actionable intelligence, repeatedly bypassed the technology entirely. It came from the black dispatches.
The most vital information often came from the marginalized and the enslaved, from individuals who were rendered legally and socially invisible by the very society they were actively working to dismantle.
It is something to consider, even as we look at our modern era of orbital satellites and quantum encryption. The human element, with all its unpredictability, vulnerability, and courage, remains the most vital and complex component of intelligence.
Very true.
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.